It began on a cold, gray morning, the 17th of March 1943, when the sound of a folder slamming against mahogany cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Coffee splashed from Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's porcelain cup, streaking the papers that could have meant death if the Gestapo had seen them. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, staring at the dark stains spreading over the word Ford Motor Company. Somewhere beyond the windows of the Abwehr headquarters, the Landwehr Canal glimmered under a thin coat of ice, the same canal where Rosa Luxemburg's body had been dumped 24 years earlier. Berlin had grown used to corpses and whispers since then, but this report, this absurd, impossible report, was something else entirely. Impossible, Canaris muttered. Propaganda. He said it to himself, though the words had no conviction. His aide, Major Friedrich Heinz, stood stiffly across the desk, eyes flicking toward the door as if even the walls might be listening. "Sir, I verified it 3 times, Heinz said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet the fear behind it was unmistakable. Intercepted communications, corroborated by agents in Mexico City, Madrid, Stockholm. The numbers, they are consistent." Canaris rubbed his temples. The paper in his hand shook ever so slightly. 1 bomber every hour. He read the line again and again, each time hoping it might change. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run Plant, Dearborn, Michigan output. 1 consolidated B-24 Liberator per hour. 1.5 million parts. 450,000 rivets. 30,000 separate components assembled into an 18-ton machine, 1 every 60 minutes. It wasn't just absurd, it was mathematically obscene. Germany's best factories could barely produce a handful of military vehicles in the same span. He thought of the workers at Heinkel and Junkers, the shortages, the bombings, the tired men clutching their ration cards. And then this, an American factory that moved like a living organism, assembling bombers faster than Germany could build its Volkswagens. Heinz cleared his throat. "Sir, we believe it's true." Canaris's eyes lifted slowly, gray and sharp beneath the heavy brow of a man who'd learned to keep secrets in a country that punished honesty. "Major, do you know what would happen if I walked into the Reich Chancellery with this?" "Yes, sir," Heinz answered quietly. "They'd call it treason." The Admiral leaned back, the chair creaking under him. He had seen empires lie to themselves before. He had seen men build monuments to their delusions. But never had he seen the mathematics of a nation become its noose. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Somewhere down the hall, a telephone rang the clipped, anxious rhythm of wartime Berlin. Canaris finally spoke again, softer now, almost to himself. "It isn't propaganda," he said. "It's arithmetic." He closed the folder and pressed it flat with trembling fingers. In that moment, he understood something few in the Reich would ever admit, that wars were not won by flags or speeches, but by machines and the hands that built them. He remembered his visit to Detroit before the war, years ago, when he'd stood at the edge of a Ford assembly line and watched steel and sweat turn into automobiles by the thousands. He'd admired it then, quietly, as an engineer admires precision. But he'd also feared what such a machine could become when turned toward destruction. Now it was happening, and it was unstoppable. "Major," he said, his voice suddenly firm again, "prepare a full analysis, every intercepted report, every source, every photograph. I want a projection of what this production means for air superiority by year's end." Heinz hesitated. "Sir, with respect, if these figures are true, we have already lost the war." The words hung in the air, dangerous and sacrilegious. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the office clock, each second striking like a hammer against truth itself. Finally, Canaris nodded once. "Then, Major," he said quietly, "we must calculate the mathematics of our defeat." He rose, walked to the window, and stared out over Berlin, the smoke from the factories rising like prayers that no one would answer. In the distance, he could almost hear the faint hum of a machine across the Atlantic, somewhere in Michigan, where men and women he would never meet were building the instrument of his nation's downfall. He could see it in his mind, the mile-long line of bombers, silver wings catching the light as they rolled into being. He imagined the workers, women with rivet guns, black men guiding engine mounts, teenagers tightening bolts. Democracy, that chaotic, noisy system the Reich despised, had become an engine. Behind him Heinz spoke again, more urgently now. "Sir, shall I brief the Foreign Ministry?" "No." Canaris turned, his expression unreadable. "They wouldn't believe it. Not yet. Maybe not ever." He walked back to his desk, fingers brushing across the stained papers. "History will not remember us kindly," he said at last, "but it will remember this factory." That night, as the lights in the Abwehr building dimmed and the city outside sank into blackout, Canaris stayed at his desk, tracing lines between reports and shipment manifests, between truth and survival. The equations didn't lie. The Americans had done the impossible not through ideology or divine favor, but through precision, inclusion, and sheer will. And somewhere, in that realization, Canaris felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Not admiration, not envy, perhaps resignation. He whispered to the empty room, "If they can build a bomber every hour, then the war is already over. We just haven't died yet." 2 years earlier, in the winter of 1941, a young Luftwaffe general had dared to present numbers that would later haunt him. Karl Kohler had come to Hermann Göring's office, clutching a report from the German military attaché in Washington, General Friedrich von Boetticher. His figures showed that American aircraft production was approaching 2,000 planes per month. Kohler's voice trembled as he spoke, not from uncertainty, but from knowing what disbelief would cost him. Göring laughed so hard that the veins in his thick neck bulged purple. "Americans," he jeered, "they build refrigerators, not war machines." He tossed the papers across the table. "Their democracy makes them weak. Their mongrel blood makes them stupid. Their Jews make them greedy. You waste my time with this nonsense." The laughter lingered, echoing against the marble of the Reich Air Ministry like a curse. Kohler gathered his papers silently. In that moment, the Reich had sealed its own fate, not with a decision, but with a laugh. By December 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Göring was still boasting to Hitler that America could never build aircraft in significant numbers. Hitler, pacing before a massive map of Europe, waved his hand as if swatting away an insect. "They are a nation of merchants, not warriors," he said. "They'll drown in their own inefficiency." That was the atmosphere into which the truth fell like rain on iron. By early 1943, from every corner of the Americas, the impossible truth was being whispered. Reports arrived from Mexico City, from neutral diplomats in Madrid, from Swedish businessmen returning from Detroit, even from intercepted letters, American workers writing to relatives in Lisbon and Buenos Aires. Each letter carried the same astonishment. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant was producing more bombers than all of Germany's aircraft factories combined. Abwehr officer Nikolaus Ritter, once a Lufthansa pilot who had lived in New York in the Roaring '20s, knew enough of America to fear that it might be true. He remembered his apartment overlooking the construction of the Chrysler Building, 200 stories of steel rising into the clouds in under 2 years. He had watched Americans build a skyscraper as casually as they built a dream. Now they were doing the same with bombers. He leaned over the maps in his office and murmured to himself, "If these numbers are real, then the war is already decided." When he carried the report to Admiral Canaris, his voice was low but steady. "Herr Admiral," he said, "it is no longer a question of courage or faith. It is mathematics and time." Canaris stared at him in silence, the weight of every calculation pressing on the air between them. He did not disagree. The intelligence came through dangerous channels. In Mexico City, a German agent named Georg Nicholas had cultivated businessmen who traveled freely between Detroit and the Mexican oil fields. One of them, an American oil executive named Harold Morrison, attended a reception at the German-Mexican Commerce Association. After several glasses of tequila, he began to talk. "I saw it with my own eyes," Morrison said to the crowd of merchants and diplomats who leaned in, half amused, half disbelieving. "The factory's over a mile long. The roof's so high that clouds form inside. Sometimes it even rains indoors. They've got 42,000 workers, including women, Negro women, building bombers like toys. It's unreal." A man at the table, Wolfgang Blau, posing as an Argentine leather trader, smiled politely while memorizing every word. Morrison continued, pulling a pencil from his pocket, sketching on a napkin. 4 engines, 1,200 horsepower each, 2 bomb bays, 8,000 pounds of payload. The place runs like a river, wing sections from one side, fuselages from another, tail assemblies from a third. They flow together into bombers. Blau raised an eyebrow. "Surely such complexity must cause delays?" Morrison laughed. "That's what the experts said, but Ford broke the bomber into 60,000 separate operations. Each worker repeats one small task until it's perfect. A woman who made breakfast yesterday now installs hydraulic lines today. They train them in days, not months." When the report reached Berlin weeks later, Ritter wrote in the margin, "They build miracles from repetition." In Madrid, Colonel José Ungría Franco's military attaché in Washington listened to similar tales from Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, who bragged over champagne that he had designed Willow Run after a single sleepless night in a hotel room, sketching out a moving line that would carry bombers past stationary workers. "Each man performs one operation," Sorensen said proudly. "Each woman too. We train 8,000 apprentices a week. 40% of our workforce is female. They've smaller hands for fine work, more patience for detail." Ungría nodded politely, concealing his excitement. Within 2 weeks, every word was in Berlin. By March 1943, Sweden, Spain, Argentina, and even Japan had confirmed the same impossible thing. A Swedish engineer named Lundberg wrote that the Americans used 1,600 specialized machine tools, some designed for a single task. The investment was beyond comprehension, $200 million in tooling alone. In a coded message from Tokyo, Japanese Commander Toshikazu Omi wrote, "This single American factory produces more aircraft monthly than all of Japan." Still, in Berlin, laughter remained stronger than logic. Goering read one of the Swedish cables aloud to his adjutant and burst out laughing. "A bomber every hour? Then perhaps their Negroes also fly them?" That was the moment when intelligence turned to illusion. The truth had arrived in Berlin, clear as daylight, and the Reich had decided to look away. Ritter stood in his office that night, staring at a map dotted with pins: Mexico City, Washington, Detroit, Madrid, Stockholm, Tokyo. Each one a signal, each one screaming the same message. Yet he knew what awaited him if he pressed further: the accusation of defeatism, the slow death inside a concentration camp. He whispered, "They will never believe it." The next morning he delivered his final report to Canaris. "If these numbers are correct," he said quietly, "then Germany has already lost the war." Canaris nodded, his eyes distant. "Perhaps the war was lost," he said. "The moment we decided laughter was proof." Outside, the radios still blared propaganda of German superiority, of destiny and purity. But in the halls of the Abwehr, the men who could read numbers began to feel a different kind of silence, the silence of inevitability. The first time the reports described clouds forming inside a factory, most of Berlin's officers thought it was a joke. Clouds, they said, inside a building? But the description was true. The Willow Run plant was so vast that its own weather sometimes drifted beneath its steel rafters. When the air grew warm and heavy from human breath and machine heat, vapor collected along the beams until it condensed and fell again as rain on the workers below. Somewhere across the Atlantic, 1,000 drops of that indoor rain were falling onto bomber wings, each one destined to darken the skies over Europe. Canaris received those details from Mexico in early February 1943. The agent's report began innocently enough: social event, German-Mexican Commerce Association, attendees, American businessman Harold Morrison, and then unfolded into something extraordinary. Morrison had toured Willow Run himself. He had seen the mile-long assembly line, the convergence of sub-assemblies, and the legions of workers, men, women, and teenagers, all performing their part of a mechanical ballet. "They build them as if they were toys," Morrison had said, a little drunk on tequila, unaware that his words were crossing oceans and destinies. "A woman who's never seen an aircraft in her life can be trained in 2 days to rivet its skin. They move faster than you'd believe. The place hums like a living thing." In the Abwehr's dim office on Tirpitzufer Street, Major Heinz had read those lines aloud, his voice trembling slightly. "Sir," he describes, "sections flowing together, like rivers to the sea, wing, fuselage, tail, each approaching from different lines." Canaris took the paper from him, reading it again, slower this time. "They've turned war into a rhythm," he murmured. "A rhythm of machines." He closed his eyes and tried to imagine it: a building so large it needed its own weather, lit by 1,000 lamps that glowed through the night. He saw workers moving in precise choreography, their faces smudged with sweat and pride. He could almost hear the clang of hammers, the hiss of pneumatic drills, the low thunder of engines being tested. Across the Atlantic, in the very heart of America, the Willow Run plant was not just producing bombers. It was redefining what humanity could do when forced to build for survival. Colonel José Hungría, the Spanish military attaché in Washington, saw it next. His position gave him access to receptions where American industrialists spoke too freely, too proudly. One evening, at the Argentine embassy, he met Charles Sorensen, the production architect behind Willow Run. Sorensen, oblivious to the fact that his every word would soon be whispered into Nazi Germany's ears, spoke of his sleepless nights in San Diego in 1940, of how he'd sketched the entire flow of bomber production in one sitting. "We don't build planes like artisans," Sorensen had said. "We build them like cars, not one by one, but in motion. The plane moves past the workers, not the other way around." Hungría, feigning admiration, asked, "And you truly believe you can produce a bomber every hour?" Sorensen smiled faintly. "We already are." That night, Hungría sent a coded cable to Berlin through Madrid's diplomatic pouch. "American production operates beyond European comprehension. The factory resembles a city. 42,000 workers, many female. 8,000 apprentices trained weekly. Women and colored workers perform critical tasks, output continuous, uninterrupted." Weeks later, the same message reached Admiral Canaris's desk, where he read it with growing disbelief. The words "women," "Negroes," and "efficiency" seemed to violate everything the Reich believed about strength. He imagined bringing this report to Hitler, trying to explain that the so-called inferior races were building the bombers that would soon bury the Reich beneath them. He didn't need to imagine the reaction. He had seen it too many times before. Göring would laugh, call it lies, call it Jewish propaganda. Himmler would sneer. Goebbels would twist it into something grotesque for the radio. Still, the evidence grew thicker by the day. A Swedish engineer named Erik Lundberg visited Willow Run that March. His report, written in the dry tone of a technician, carried more terror than any bomb. "The plant operates with precision that defies expectation. 1,600 specialized machine tools. Tooling investment alone estimated at $200 million. Work continues in 3 shifts, with women composing a significant portion of the labor force. Subassemblies converge hourly. Aircraft roll off the line at a rate no European facility could achieve. Even Japanese intelligence, intercepted by the Germans themselves, confirmed it." Commander Toshikazu Omi's message to Tokyo read, "This one American factory exceeds the entire Japanese aviation industry in output." In the Abwehr's map room, pins marked every origin of confirmation: Sweden, Spain, Mexico, Argentina, Japan. Red threads connected them to one name: Willow Run. Ritter stood before that map one evening, exhausted, chain-smoking as if each cigarette might burn away the disbelief around him. "We have 17 independent sources," he said to Canaris, who sat quietly in the half-light. "Different languages, different motives, same conclusion. It's real." Canaris nodded. His hand lingered over the glowing tip of Ritter's cigarette, tracing smoke in the air like a graph of inevitability. "Then, mathematics," he said softly, "has become our executioner." For the first time in his long career of secrets and betrayals, Canaris felt the quiet weight of awe. He was a soldier, yes, but also a man who admired engineering, who understood the sacred order in precision. What the Americans had built was not merely a machine, but a cathedral of motion. He imagined the sound, not the roar of engines, but the heartbeat of creation. Metal meeting metal, spark meeting purpose. Each rivet hammered by a woman whose brother was flying over Bremen. Each bolt tightened by a man who had lost someone at Pearl Harbor. It was no longer war as Germany knew it, it was a kind of faith. That night, he wrote a note in his private journal. "They have achieved what we refused to believe possible, a democracy that manufactures as efficiently as it governs. Each worker an engineer, each citizen a soldier. The Americans have industrialized belief itself." He closed the journal, knowing no one in power would ever read it. In the coming months, every report from abroad would confirm the same terrible symmetry, that the Allies' greatest weapon wasn't the bomber itself, but the factory that birthed it. And yet in Berlin, the men in power would continue to laugh. By April 1943, the evidence was a mountain no loyal German could climb without fear of falling from it. 17 independent sources had confirmed what every mathematician, engineer, and realist in the Abwehr already knew. The Ford Willow Run plant was producing a bomber every hour. Yet every time Admiral Canaris presented the truth, it was like throwing a torch into a frozen sea. The flame died before it touched the surface. He had gathered everything: coded messages, shipping manifests, photographs smuggled through Spain, even railroad invoices showing millions of pounds of aluminum shipped to Michigan each month. The numbers were devastating: 16 million pounds of aluminum consumed by one factory every 30 days. Germany's entire monthly aluminum production couldn't match it. And still, no one in power would believe. When Canaris stood before Hermann Göring that April morning, the air inside Karin Hall felt heavier than stone. Göring was enormous now, swollen with luxury, while the nation starved, wrapped in silk robes embroidered with eagles. Canaris spread his evidence across the oak table. Maps, graphs, telegrams, photographs of assembly lines stretching beyond sight. "Reichsmarschall," he began, voice measured but tense, "these are not speculations. We have confirmation from 17 independent sources. The Ford plant in Michigan produces one B-24 bomber per hour, a rate consistent since January." Göring picked up one of the photos, squinting at it through gold-framed spectacles. It showed the Willow Run line, hundreds of workers, engines suspended mid-air, aircraft in every stage of birth. Canaris waited. Then Göring laughed, that awful, bellowing laugh that made everyone in the room flinch. "One bomber an hour? My dear Admiral, you've been reading fairy tales. These are wooden mock-ups, Hollywood props for their propaganda films." "Sir, the aluminum shipments," Canaris tried, but Göring's laughter grew louder. "Aluminum? Do they mine it from their Negro workers? Or perhaps their women riveters?" His smile twisted into a sneer. "You've been deceived, Canaris. You've been poisoned by their lies. They want us to believe democracy can build like the Reich." Ridiculous. The Admiral felt the room close in on him. His hand trembled slightly as he gathered the papers, his every movement watched by Goering's adjutants. He knew better than to argue further. Men had vanished for less. "Dismissed," Goering said coldly. "And burn that nonsense before the Führer hears you've lost faith in the Reich." But Hitler did hear. Within a week, Canaris was summoned to the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, in East Prussia. It was the 27th of April 1943. Snow still clung to the forest, and the smell of damp pine mixed with the heavy odor of diesel and fear. Canaris arrived with a single leather case inside, the full proof of America's industrial miracle. He was led past guards and generals to a map room where Hitler stood over a vast table, his fingers tracing lines toward Kursk, where he believed destiny still favored Germany. "Mein Führer," Canaris began, keeping his voice steady, "if the Americans are producing 1,400 heavy bombers monthly, plus equal numbers of fighters and the British contribution, our air defenses will soon be overwhelmed." Hitler looked up sharply, blue eyes burning with irritation. "Admiral," he said, "you sound like an old woman reading bedtime stories. The Americans can mass-produce refrigerators, not aircraft. Do you understand the difference? Precision, discipline, craftsmanship, these cannot be taught to mongrels and women." Canaris placed a photograph on the map. This was taken at the Willow Run facility in Michigan, aircraft lined nose to tail, over 12,000 cars in the parking lot, 3 shifts. They've achieved the impossible. Hitler waved it away. Photographic tricks. The Americans are experts in illusion. They claim to have achieved in 16 months what took us 6 years of preparation. It's impossible. Goebbels, standing at the edge of the room, smirked. "The propaganda value is impressive, though, mein Führer. The enemy believes their own fantasies." Canaris felt a pulse of despair rise through his chest. "Sir," he said, voice breaking for the first time, "this is not fantasy. It is arithmetic. If you refuse to believe the numbers, we will lose this war not by enemy strength, but by our blindness." Hitler turned on him, the room going deathly quiet. "Then perhaps you should join the enemy whose arithmetic you admire so much," he said coldly. "Leave my sight." That night, in his quarters, Canaris unlocked his briefcase and removed the final piece of evidence, a film reel smuggled from Switzerland. It had been obtained at immense risk from an American contact, sent through Spain under diplomatic seal. It showed the assembly line of Willow Run in motion bombers sliding forward under the camera's gaze, wings attached, engines mounted, women riveting with mechanical precision. He called for his deputy, Hans Oster. Together, they projected the film onto the far wall of the office, curtains drawn tight. For 5 minutes, they watched in silence as an entire industrial civilization unfolded before them. The camera drifted past row after row of workers, faces of every color and age, all synchronized to a rhythm of hammers and engines. When the reel ended, Oster exhaled softly. "Mein Gott? It's true." Canaris nodded slowly, then took a lighter from his pocket. He held the flame to the edge of the film, watching it curl and blacken, the cellulose melting into ash. Oster stepped forward. "Sir? We cannot show it," Canaris said. "They would call it treason. They would accuse us of fabrication or worse, of defeatism. This film would not save us. It would only condemn us." He watched the last strip of film crumble to dust and whispered, "Let it burn. Perhaps truth deserves a quieter death." Outside, Berlin slept beneath blackout curtains, dreaming of victory as the bombs in England were still being forged, minute by minute, on a factory line in Michigan. And in a small office, 2 men, the last believers in mathematics over mythology, stared into the dark and listened to the faint crackle of burning truth. The truth had burned in Canaris's office that night, but the ashes refused to disappear. By the end of 1943, Willow Run was no longer rumor or theory. It was a living equation written in smoke across the European sky. Yet in Berlin, The leadership still treated arithmetic like heresy. Every new document that reached the Abwehr was stamped verboten before it was even read. Photographs smuggled through Spain showed parking lots filled with 12,000 cars, 3 shifts of workers. Aerial imagery confirmed 47 finished B-24 seconds parked on adjacent airfields, engines gleaming in the sun. Even the patterns of shadows through the factory skylights matched the American blueprints. The analysis was undeniable. But when the photos reached Göring again, he snorted and tossed them aside. "Clever Americans," he said. "They build scale models, take trick photographs. We are fighting illusionists, not engineers." For once, Canaris said nothing. He was tired. Tired of shouting numbers into deafness, tired of translating truth for men who had divorced themselves from reality. Behind every sheet of paper he read, he could see the ghosts of the future. Factories in ruins, cities in ashes, young pilots who would die believing their leaders had a plan. He didn't know then that this was his last season of freedom. It was Albert Speer who truly understood. The armaments minister, a man who had built cathedrals of steel and concrete for Hitler's regime, was also one of the few who could read numbers without ideological blindness. Late at night, Speer read the American production estimates, cross-checked them against known shipments of aluminum, oil, and rubber, and closed his eyes in silent horror. In his private diary on the 15th of May 1943, he wrote, "If the Willow Run figures are even half correct, we face not defeat but annihilation. They produce in 1 month what we do in a year. I cannot speak this truth. To do so would sign my death warrant." He knew, as Canaris did, that the real enemy was no longer America's Army or Navy. It was time itself. The clock inside Willow Run ticked faster than any in Germany. Every 63 minutes, another bomber rolled out, its wings catching the light, its engines ready to fly. At the same time, Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, a trained economist turned SS officer, submitted a report to Himmler. His tone was blunt, almost clinical. The Ford Motor Company's peacetime production in 1941 was 1.1 million vehicles. They have converted that capacity to bombers. By June 1944, American output will exceed 80,000 aircraft annually. The implications are total and final. Ohlendorf sealed the report with trembling hands. He knew that speaking truth in this regime was suicide. That same month, Canaris was summoned again, this time not to advise, but to be questioned. The rumors were spreading. Defeatism, disloyalty, treachery. He had dared to tell Hitler the war could not be won by faith alone. He had dared to believe in mathematics. When he returned to his office, Hans Oster was waiting, pale and quiet. "They are watching us," Oster said. "Even our typewriters have ears now." Canaris smiled faintly. "Then we should at least give them something worth listening to." Christmas Eve, 1943. Berlin was wrapped in blackout. Beyond the curtains, snow fell in perfect silence. Inside the Abwehr headquarters, Canaris sat alone, reading the latest intercepted report from Washington American production projections for the coming year. B-24 Liberators, 18,000. B-17 Flying Fortresses, 12,000. B-29 Superfortresses, 1,000. Fighter aircraft, 40,000. Total, 86,000 planes in 1 year. He exhaled slowly, letting the paper fall to the desk. The enormity of it made words meaningless. The war, he realized, had already become a kind of suicide, one carried out with blind conviction and patriotic speeches. When the figures reached Hitler, he dismissed them with contempt. The Americans claim they will produce more aircraft in 1 year than all nations in history combined. Absurd! If that were true, their factories would cover half their country. But they almost did. By early 1944, the last remnants of the Abwehr's independence were gone. Canaris was removed, replaced by Walter Schellenberg, a loyalist too frightened to question orders. Oster was arrested months later, accused of conspiracy. The walls were closing in. Yet truth doesn't vanish because a dictator forbids it. It hides, it waits, and then it explodes. The 20th of February, 1944, the day the Luftwaffe called Big Week. Over 1,000 American bombers filled the sky above Germany, more aircraft in one formation than the Reich's intelligence had ever dared to imagine. The sky itself seemed to darken. Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's finest fighter aces, returned from the battle pale and shaken. He went straight to Göring's headquarters and saluted weakly. "Herr Reichsmarschall," he said, "I counted 800 bombers in one wave. They are real, they are not propaganda, and they are dropping real bombs." Göring said nothing. For the first time in years, the laughter had stopped. In the following weeks, Allied bombers flattened ball-bearing plants, engine works, and aircraft factories. Every night, the horizon glowed red. By June 1944, when Allied forces stormed Normandy under a sky of 11,000 aircraft, the Luftwaffe could muster fewer than 300 fighters. A message from Field Marshal Hugo Sperling to Berlin was brutally clear. The enemy's air superiority is absolute. Our intelligence was correct. We were deceived not by the Americans, but by ourselves. Somewhere in a prison cell, Canaris received word of the message. He smiled faintly in the dark. "At last," he murmured, "they've begun to count." By April 1944, Willow Run reached its peak 453 bombers in 468 hours, one B-24 every 63 minutes. 42,000 workers, 11,000 women, 3,800 African Americans, 1,200 disabled. If Göring could have seen that workforce women with grease on their hands, black men operating precision machinery, boys barely 16 managing supply chains, he would have understood too late what he'd refused to believe. That democracy's strength came not from purity, but from participation. The so-called inferior races were outproducing the master race by orders of magnitude. And all the while, in the silence of his cell, the man who had tried to warn them sat waiting for the inevitable knock at his door. By the spring of 1944, the German night was no longer dark, it pulsed with fire. From every horizon, the sky glowed with the orange reflection of burning cities, and the deep, continuous hum of American bombers rolled like thunder across the continent. The sound was endless, mechanical, merciless. It was the sound of arithmetic made flesh. In a hidden cell within Flossenburg, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris could still hear that sound even through the stone walls. Sometimes it came in dreams, the low metallic roar, the faint tremor under his feet. He would wake before dawn, lips moving silently, reciting numbers, dates, production charts that no longer mattered. He had told them everything, shown them everything, and still they had laughed. Now the truth had taken flight, wearing the wings of 1,000 B-24 seconds born in a factory they called impossible. He wasn't alone in that cell. Hans Oster sat beside him, thinner now, the same faint calm that had carried him through interrogation. One night, when the guard's boots faded down the corridor, Oster spoke softly. "You remember what you said, Willie, that the Americans had turned belief into an industry?" Canaris smiled weakly. "I was wrong," he whispered. "They turned work into faith, and faith into victory." They were executed on the same day, April 9th, 1945, exactly 2 years after Canaris had warned that Germany's defeat was a matter of mathematics and time. Outside the camp, Allied bombers, many built at Willow Run, were crossing into German airspace, engines humming like an epitaph. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated his final birthday on April 20th. The bunker stank of oil, decay, and fear. Above ground, the last report from the Abwehr lay forgotten on a desk already buried in ash. It was dated that same day. Willow Run production confirmed. "We reported this truth 2 years ago. We were not believed." Germany dies not from lack of intelligence, but from lack of wisdom, to believe intelligence that contradicts what we wish to be true. No one read it. The Reich had less than 10 days left to live. By then, the truth was visible from every window. American bombers, British bombers, Soviet artillery, all of it, the final echo of an industrial miracle the Nazis had mocked. Reality, at last, had become the conqueror. When the war ended, the numbers were tallied like gravestones. 18,188 B-24 seconds built. 8,685 from Willow Run alone, each one composed of 1.5 million parts, assembled not by slaves or soldiers, but by citizens, men, women, and teenagers who worked double shifts, slept in parking lots, and believed that every rivet could shorten the war. At peak, the factory's floor space covered 3.5 million square feet. It consumed more electricity than entire German cities. Its cost $200 million was half the total investment of Germany's entire aircraft industry since 1933. It was a temple to the simple, stubborn power of free people. Years later, when historians interviewed Albert Speer in his cell at Spandau, they asked him the question that haunted them all: why did Germany refuse to believe the truth? Speer leaned back against the wall, his eyes hollow. Because to accept it, he said, would have meant accepting that everything we believed was wrong, that democracy is not weakness, that diversity is not chaos, that women and workers and Jews and Negroes could outproduce us not in spite of their system, but because of it. We could not survive that thought. He looked at the floor for a long time, then added, "We didn't lose to bombers, we lost to an idea." In 1985, at the dedication of the Yankee Air Museum at Willow Run, a small crowd gathered beneath the same rafters where clouds had once formed and rained on workers below. Among them stood Rose Will Monroe, the woman whose strong arms and bright smile had inspired Rosie the Riveter. Her hands were older now, the lines of time cut deep from years of work, but when she spoke, her voice still carried the rhythm of the factory floor. A tall, silver-haired man stepped forward, former Luftwaffe pilot Hans Rudel, who had once flown against the very bombers she built. He looked at her with quiet wonder. "How did you do it?" he asked. "How did you build so many, so fast?" Rose smiled. "Honey," she said, "we just went to work every day and did our job. Nothing fancy. Just punch in, build bombers, punch out. Democracy isn't complicated. It's just free people doing their best." Rudel lowered his gaze. "We were told democracy made you weak," he said softly. "That your diversity made you slow. We were told lies, and those lies killed millions." For a long moment, they stood there together, the builder and the destroyer, beneath the same roof that had once echoed with the hum of victory. In the ruins of Berlin, American officers had found one last Abwehr report, its final line written in careful ink. Reality does not bend to ideology. Mathematics does not yield to mythology. Truth ignored becomes tragedy. It had never reached Hitler, but history did. Because Willow Run built more than bombers. It built a lesson that strength is not born from purity, but from unity. Not from fear, but from freedom. Every 63 minutes, another B-24 had rolled off that line, a heartbeat of democracy, a pulse of defiance. And when those bombers crossed the Atlantic, they carried not only bombs, but proof. That reality, indifferent and eternal, doesn't care what men choose to believe. It simply waits, and when the lies run out, it flies.